Mephibosheth. Have you ever heard of that word? Is it the name of an excavator that you would use in the gravel pit? No. Is it a new drug by a pharmaceutical company that's just come on the market? No. Mephibosheth has a lot of syllables. What is it? Well, it happens to be the name of a man. And that man lived years ago in the Old Testament. And that's my lesson today. When Mephibosheth was 5 years old, news came to Saul's palace in Gibeon, where he lived, that King Saul and Prince Jonathan had just been killed on the battlefield. The Israelites, they were fighting the Philistines at Mount Gilboa in the Battle of Jezreel. And it created panic. That was immediate and it was total. If there ever was an enemy that was ruthless, it was the Philistines. With Saul now dead and his son dead, the whole royal house and everyone in it, they were now slated for destruction. And there's going to be no mercy. Everyone connected with the name of Saul and Jonathan were about to die. And without Saul and Jonathan on the throne, the Philistines, they were now going to clean house. Everyone related to the house of Saul, they'd be targeted, put to death, and the whole Saul regime would suddenly all disappear. Mephibosheth, he was the son of Jonathan. Jonathan was David's best friend. Jonathan's young son in our story is going to show up 3 times in David's life. And that's what my story today is all about. It's going to be a story of generosity. It's going to be a story of forgiveness. And unlike anything probably you've ever heard, this young kid, Mephibosheth, is going to be channeled into a success story better than most stories that you've read. It's like an Old Testament Jesus story. He would tell this in the New Testament. So here we go. All of the servants in Saul's palace, when they got word that the king and his son were dead, they ran for their life. They now expected the worst, and the Philistines, they're going to slaughter them all. Those were the rules in those days. When the king was destroyed, so was his whole household. Mephibosheth, he had a nurse. When word got back that the king and his son were dead, she grabbed this little 5-year-old and ran with him in her arms out the palace door. But in her going through the door, she tripped and fell. And in the fall, that little 5-year-old boy broke both his ankles. 2 Samuel 4:4. He was picked up, carried by the escaping household. They went east across the Jordan River Valley to safety. They landed in a small village called Lodabar. Poor little Mephibosheth, bones in his ankles, they knit very badly, if at all. And he was never able to walk again. He grew up in Lodabar, which is in present-day Syria, in obscurity, and he was always lame. And he was the only living heir of the once great house of Saul. Nobody knew it. His life would be in danger, and that secret was never allowed to get out. So he grew up there in that royal identity, hidden, suppressed. All the privileges that he was entitled to back there in his version of the Buckingham Palace, they were all denied. And what could be more insulting? It was aggravated by his limp. He was permanently handicapped by his lameness. And none of it was his fault. It all happened when he was too young to remember. That's what faced this sudden exile, the horrible fall, the permanent disability, the eventual loss of the throne, and his whole future ahead of him. I suppose you could say poor Mephibosheth, he was nothing but a victim. His past could only be remembered by the stories that were passed on. He probably heard from his nurse, who was holding him when he fell, told him all the nice things that Mephibosheth could never remember growing up in that privileged palace. He got what little identity he had only from hearsay, little stories growing up through the lips of past storytellers. Mephibosheth, growing up in Lodabar, now in that far country, hearing these stories told by the servants, probably laid around the evening fire, he probably felt victimized. What a rotten start to life. Grandpa dies, he's the king. Father dies, he's heir to the throne. His accident leaves him scarred for life, booted out of his own country, having fled for his life. And now look at it. He's growing up in a foreign land. What future does he have? Have any of you been in that mess? I teach a class every Sunday morning, and in my class are immigrants that come from a foreign land, and you would be surprised. Their story is almost Mephibosheth's story. Some of them are almost Holocaust survivors. Maybe you're one of them. It wouldn't surprise me when Mephibosheth would hear these stories of his past, that another name keeps cropping up in the conversation. It's a man by the name of David, his father's best friend. He heard about how deeply his father Jonathan loved and trusted this David, that shepherd boy from over there in Bethlehem. From age 5, Mephibosheth could still picture his father and David visiting and telling each other tales of adventure. And then it was all over. He had no grandpa, no father, no palace, no kingship, just a world of royalty that had all been destroyed. And now his world had become an existence of nothing but misery. Here he was, a scapegoat, crippled, in obscurity, in a foreign land, miles from his childhood memories, in a now uncaring world in a foreign land. Is that your world? Is that the world now you live in? Uncaring? Unforgiving? Well, Mephibosheth is now an adult. Let's let him grow up. This next story, in his story, is going to take place many years up. Years have now passed. He's still cruelly handicapped because of that accident. Being badly crippled, the story of his past is now beginning to fade away. As it fades away, strangers arrived in the town of Lodabar. And word gets around, they're asking for him. And they found him. And they told him what he wanted. They said to him, back in Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, there's a new king by the name of David. David? Was this the David that he'd been told about in all those stories about his dad? Was this the David who was Jonathan's best friend? If it was, what does he want? Apparently, David had been searching the land from top to bottom, looking for any trace of Saul's descendants. And apparently, word got back to David that one had been found. And he was living in a land outside Israel. And it was him. Mephibosheth. He'd been found out. They brought him fresh clothes. They dressed him up. They put him on a horse. And they took him to Jerusalem. I wonder what through his mind as the steps got closer to that new city. Never in his wildest dreams did he ever think that this would happen. He had never left that little hamlet of Lodabar before. He had heard of the Jordan River, and now he had crossed over it. He knew that he was a Jew, but he'd never been in Jewish territory before. And as he was traveling along on his horse with this company, he saw pomegranates, he saw orchards of vineyards, sheep grazing, cattle lowing, fields being plowed, children playing, retirees like me sitting under a palm tree, larger villages, and modern roads. He had never seen anything like it. Mephibosheth was brought into the presence of David, the king, in the palace that he had left years ago as a 5-year-old boy. He didn't remember any of it. His heart beat faster as he entered the throne room. His mind seemed to speak to him as he gazed at all this splendor. My dad and mom, they lived here, along with Grandpa Saul. He expected the worst. Every step brought him nearer to his doom. His wretched story of his victimized life is now going to come to an end. He thought he would face a bloody execution, and he was ready for it. He knew that it was going to happen one day. He just didn't want it to happen now. He felt that he had been beaten down so often that he knew finally this would be the end of it. Then there, in front of him, sitting on the throne, was the king. He was surrounded by the royal court, all dressed like the king in royal attire. He tried not to show his terror, but his face blushed. He wasn't told any protocol how to behave in the presence of the king. Do I bow? Do I fall on my knees? Nobody told him. He felt like he was just running now out the door. He looked for a door to escape. King David, observing his fear and seeing his shyness, he waylaid his terror, and he called him gently, his name. David addressed him, Mephibosheth. He had the voice of somebody who he thought knew him, and he knew him a long time. Mephibosheth's anxiety suddenly left him. He relaxed. Something told him that everything is all right. What Mephibosheth didn't know when he was brought into David's court, and he could never have imagined in his wildest dreams, he was there to be loved. 2 Samuel 9, verse 6. Only a month or so earlier, David had asked, is there any descendants of Saul around whom he could love in his friend Jonathan's name? Up until now, he's been fighting wars. He's been enlarging his borders. He's been establishing his kingly authority. Having now settled in as a king, the tasks were all over. He was ready now to look after his own personal affairs, his own chores. One of them, did his predecessor Saul have any living relatives? That was his job now, when things had settled down. Mephibosheth, he had no idea that his father Jonathan had made a covenant with David, binding them together in loyalty to each other, and any future payoffs in the spring. When Jonathan helped David escape Saul, all those murderous plots, David gave his solemn promise to continue his loyal love to any of Jonathan's descendants. 1 Samuel 20:14. Who was Jonathan's offspring? Mephibosheth, and he didn't know it. So David's promised love for Jonathan was now standing in front of him. David emerged as a king who was full of justice, and if you read his story, he is full of fairness. Now comes another quality: love for his friend. Love, in this story of 1 Samuel, is the Hebrew word called chesed. It's a deeper meaning than our English word love. In Hebrew, chesed means dependability, commitment, and reliability. It means the same as God's love for us. It's a word that your husband or your wife said to you the day that you were married, in the vows that you took on your wedding day. That's the word chesed. Well, remember, God so cheseded the world, he loved the world. Same word. That's what Mephibosheth received from David that day when he stood before him in that throne room. That young man had never been loved that deeply before in his whole life. I want you to pretend you're Mephibosheth for a minute. He left Lodabar in Syria, his little hamlet, in hiding. He now stands before the king of Israel, King David. The first words out of the king's mouth is this young man's name, Mephibosheth. No longer a nameless exile on the run, in hiding. No longer was he ashamed or disarmed or dishonored. His past reputation was wiped clean. And from this meeting on, his name is going to be mentioned 7 times in this passage of Scripture. And he's going to get a new identity, not from his passport, but from the king, who's talking to him in front of him, sharing his love. In 2 Samuel 9, verse 7, David told him, Mephibosheth, don't be afraid. Don't have any fear. That phrase shows up a lot in the Scripture. I don't think it ever was more profoundly told than in this story. And Mephibosheth wasn't ready for what's coming next. David proved his love by giving this young man a gift. Do you know what his gift was? He turned over to Mephibosheth all the lands of his grandfather Saul, that he would now have an independent income. He could now manage the farms and the vineyards that belonged to his grandfather and take care of all those affairs and have his household income all to his own. Tell me, is that love? Unselfish, generous, extravagant? The love germinated in a covenant. David literally read to this young man his father's last will and testament. David could have kept his mouth shut. He didn't have to do this. Nobody would have known being king. He could have kept it all for himself, and no one would have been the wiser. Mephibosheth becomes the long-lost heir. Well, this story ends on a very high note. After Mephibosheth received his inheritance from the king said to him, I want you now, Mephibosheth, to become my son. I'm going to adopt you. You're going to be my honored guest as a member of my family here in the palace. You'll now live with me. David's house will now be Mephibosheth's house. You'll eat your meals at my table. You'll sit at my table. Treated as a king's son. He was going to now live in the house of love. And best yet, sitting at the table would cover all his wounds of those little broken ankles that he was never able to walk on. When you hear the story of Mephibosheth, does it remind you of anything? Crippled by a fall? That was Adam and Eve. sought by a king? That was Jesus looking for you, seated at the table of the king. If you're a follower of him, he's got a special place in heaven at his table waiting for you. Does that give you a glimpse of yourself? You were born into this world crippled by a fall. And then the king came and he died for you. That's the Easter story. The gospel miracle, that's the resurrection. Christ died for you. And one day you're going to eat with him at his table in his heavenly court. Best of all, he adopted you. You became his son. That's what the book says. And every time such love is proclaimed, you are probably witnessing the Lord's Prayer at its best. Thy kingdom come. That's the story of Mephibosheth. Did you like it? Well, that's your story. What I just said about him, I just said about you. Come on back next week. I'll have something more for you.